Hi guys, and thank you for joining. So today I have for you a true crime case. I will also be doing my makeup at the same time, and I also have a word in Romanian. Now, this video was actually prepared for the Christmas period, and that's the reason why the word in Romanian is going to be like, December holidays related. And also the case more or less is like, December focused, something with cookies and stuff like that. Obviously a true crime case. So even though we've got cookies in there, is nothing nice or nothing positive, right? So the word for today is Moș Nicolae. Moș Nicolae. Moș Nicolae. And I'm going to tell you towards the end of the video what the name means in English and also the meaning behind the name. Harrison would take long walks and play basketball with the local kids. He really liked entertaining them with his Cookie Monster plush toy. He would talk to his puppet all the time. He would sleep with the blue Cookie Monster. He would pretend play Sesame Street, talk to the Cookie Monster every day, and all in all, he was his favorite toy. He just adored his Cookie Monster. And like I said just a couple of minutes ago, no guys, this video is not made for kids, not in the slightest. Because other times, kids would actually find Harrison digging graves, and Harrison would say that it was for dogs. I don't know, but I guess we'll find out. During the 1980s, the city of Pennsylvania was horrified because of three notorious serial killers. Gary Heidnik, known as the Frankfurt Slasher, who murdered 7 people and held several more women in a torture chamber in his basement. Then we also had Leonard Christopher, who got arrested after a victim escaped, linking him to at least 7 murders of women in the Frankfurt area. But that's not all, because during the summer of 1987, police would respond to complaints of people living at a rundown apartment complex in North Philadelphia. There was a horrendous smell and people just couldn't take it anymore. It was summer, so, on that hot, sweaty day, behind the door, women's decomposing bodies were found. It was so humid on Sunday, August the 9th, 1987, that it felt like you just couldn't breathe. 1631 North Street building seemed to be abandoned, but it wasn't quite abandoned because in this building, some people who couldn't afford much, they would actually rent apartments. The city continued to board up and close shops on many of the buildings because there was a problem with drug dealers and pimps taking over everything, which resulted in a lot of drug busts and domestic disputes. In this building on 1631 North Street, there was sometimes running water, but other times not so much. The front entrance had a broken door and quite a lot of rubbish, which blocked the entryway. You could see the front windows shattered, which meant that anyone could get into the apartment. You would assume that, judging by the state of it, no one would live there because it just wasn't safe, and also the neighborhood was quite dangerous. But still, people did live there, some who didn't really have much choice. There were drug addicts living there were homeless people living there were others living there who had mental health issues, and this was their home. So it wasn't really surprising that a lot of people there were kind of depending on drugs because of their struggles, but then also because of the addictions. Officer Pete Scalatino was the first to respond to the complaints of foul smell. As soon as he entered the building, he just knew this was the scent of death. Following the smell, he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where he reached an apartment which completely stank. The door was open, so he went into the front room of the apartment. This room was full of food containers, moldy newspapers and magazines, dried feces, filthy clothes, which were piled knee-high. On the wall, he could see some sketches. One in particular was quite disturbing. It was a drawing of a naked woman with some writing over it in what seemed to be dried blood. The officer walked past the kitchen to a door that he believed would lead him to a room. The smell was just getting worse, so he knew that the cause of the smell was coming from whatever was behind this door. The name Marty was engraved into the door, and below there was an open keyhole. So the police officer, he bent down and he looked through this keyhole. He spotted something which looked like a human figure, so he demanded for that person to open the door, but he then realized that these legs, they were not moving, so he decided to call for backup. When investigator Charles Johnson arrived, the door was slightly opened and the body of a black female lying on a mattress was there in plain view. The body was bloated and decomposing. Next to the mattresses, there was a second body, another female lying dead on the floor. Police didn't know at this point if these were drug-related deaths or they were homicides. So the police taped off the scene, and as authorities went through all of the waste in this apartment, a third body was discovered beneath all of the rubbish. These were only skeletal remains, which meant that whatever happened in the apartment went on for quite some time. As the search went on, through syringes and spoons, broken glass, dog feces, and human remains, within a few hours, another victim was found. This body was mummified in sheets. The search of the apartment went through the night. At 5:30 in the morning, they discovered yet another body, hidden between two mattresses. This body was wrapped or bound, but it was left to decompose past the point of gender identification. Another officer called to the men who were in the back room. He found a body in the front closet covered with garbage and old clothing. Because of the rain and also the dark, the search got more uncomfortable and it got quite difficult to see as well. The body count by that point was up to 6 victims when the search was called off until the following morning. Crowds of people were gathering, not only neighbors but from the city as well, when the media caught wind of a potential serial killing spree in Philadelphia. The next thing you know, there were news teams everywhere. On August the 10th, the following day, police started searching outside of the apartment structure. Officers and crews, they started to dig around, also searching the top of the building. And it was on top of the building that the officers found even more body parts, a leg and a foot dismembered. What the hell is going on? In the morning newspapers, the tenant of this apartment was publicly named. He was a handsome young black man in healthy physical condition. His name was Harrison Graham. Police put out an APB and soon sheriffs and officers and every other authority in the area were on the lookout for this Harrison. Harrison was known as Marty by his neighbors. He was described as quiet and quite easygoing. The women who were tenants were never scared of him, and actually he helped some of the women out. He did some handiwork for them, and he had no history of posing any kind of threat. He was well known in the area where he offered his services as a handyman. However, word on the streets, specifically from drug users, kind of gave a different picture of this Harrison. While Harrison seemed to be well-mannered, he was also dealing some of the more popular drugs and participating in the lifestyle. He was a drug user himself. He received $300 each month in Social Security, but he seemed to be making more money because of the drugs that he was dealing. He also had a violent side, and he once dangled a woman from his apartment window. An acquaintance also reported that Marty kept a scrapbook with drawings of naked women and dismembered body parts. Harrison Frank Graham was born on September the 9th, 1959 in Philadelphia. He was the eldest of 5 children, and I will refer to him moving on as Marty. Early on in his childhood, he showed some signs of an intellectual disability, and he had problems with academic performance and discipline at school. He attended the only high school, but he was forced to drop out after the 10th grade because of his failing grades and his absences. His mother would later claim that in 1971, Marty was diagnosed with a mental disorder and he spent 2 years in a mental hospital or a care facility, but her claim was actually never verified, so we just don't know for sure. In the early 1970s, Marty, he started working. He would usually work in the construction industry. In 1979, he left his parents' home and he moved to North Philadelphia, where he found housing in a neighborhood filled with poverty and crime. During this time, he started drinking alcohol, he started using drugs, spending time with pimps and prostitutes. He was tall and athletic, but he was never considered violent towards others, and he didn't have any criminal record either. In 1983, Marty rented an apartment in a housing complex with mostly vacant spaces. A few of the residents, including him, fenced off an area of the apartment parking lot and they turned it into a place to buy and sell drugs. In the next 4 years, Marty turned his apartment into a drug den, where his friends and acquaintances would often visit to buy and use drugs, consisting mainly of Ritalin and similar substances. But even though Marty sold drugs, he used drugs, he was never known to be violent or do anything violent. He paid his rent on a regular basis. He played basketball with the local youth. He lived off his disability pension, and he was even described as a nice man by his friends and neighbors. During the summer of 1987, which is the time of these horrific discoveries, Marty's neighbors complained to the landlord about this foul smell coming out of his apartment. The landlord told him quite a few times to sort it out, but he was ignored. So on August the 9th, the landlord kicked Marty out. Marty didn't allow anyone in that apartment, boarding up the front door with boards before he took his personal belongings and fled via the fire escape. The landlord couldn't get into his apartment, so he decided to call the police. The police officer broke down the door when they made the discoveries of the bodies, including traces of blood, drugs, a layer of garbage 40 centimeters high, a pile of dirty mattresses, and a skeleton. In the closet, there were more skeletonized remains wrapped up in a blanket. When they inspected the roof, the investigators found a green duffel bag which had the bones of the hands, feet, and legs of another murder victim. An excavation of the basement revealed a skull, rib cage, and pelvic bone belonging to a 7th victim. All of the bodies, except for 2, were in a state of severe decomposition, so police found it difficult to determine the cause of death. The cause of death for the other 2 victims was determined to be strangulation. The victims were autopsied and no signs of physical trauma or violence were found. The first 2 bodies decomposed rapidly because of the weather, but they had only been dead for a few days. While the coroners were able to say that these bodies were female, the other victims were less identifiable. Now, during all of this, remember how the media was all over this case? The Daily News printed a story about the relatives and friends of Cookie Mattis, a victim. When they first heard reports that Cookie could be among the victims, they knew it was her. Her husband heard about the shirt found on one of the bodies, and that's when he knew that this victim was Cookie because he was the one who bought her that shirt. Anthropologists were also brought in to dissect information from tissue and bones. Within a week, the public would be extremely helpful to the police to solve the identity of the victims. But Marty was still at large. He was placed on a wanted list, and during the following week, he was seen on public transport fast food restaurants, homeless shelters, and a car wash, but he avoided arrest each time. A husband came forward to police to ask about his wife. She was missing for over 2 years. The roommate of another victim told authorities that she believed Sandra Garvin went to buy drugs from Marty, but she never returned. Debris from the crime scene filled in missing pieces. Jewelry, including a heart-shaped necklace and 3 earrings, were found, which were published in the media. Seeing the photos, relatives stepped forward to help identify another 2 victims. But Marty was still nowhere to be found. He had 4 younger siblings and his mother, Lily, all living in the Philadelphia area. The family actually put out a public plea for Marty to just come home. I think that this was actually an arrangement with the police to kind of draw Marty out of hiding. He'd been seen at local shelters, even on a city bus, but he somehow didn't get caught. At the same time, investigators continued searching the building, on top of it, beneath it, and next to it. And they found even more stuff. I know, guys, this is just like, never ending. Some more bones were exhumed from the grounds surrounding the apartment, but after a close examination by the coroner, these were deemed to be animal remains and not human remains. On August 15th, however, another body was discovered. The search by then expanded to surrounding buildings and in the basement of a complex down the street from Marty's apartment, where a body wrapped in a blanket and bound with electrical cord was discovered under a burn pile. This was very similar to the other bodies that the police found. Looking closer, only the torso and the skull remained, leading investigators to question if this was an 8th victim or if this would be the connection to previously found leg bones in the duffel bag, remember, found on the roof. The medical examiner was working really hard to identify all of the victims. One female was identified, Mary Jeter Mathis, or as friends and relatives called her, Cookie Mathis. She was 36 years old and she was a mother of 5. Her body was identified through fingerprints, a welfare card, and a distinctive t-shirt with a rose design. Mary was sadly a drug addict. She was separated from her husband, living with her 5 children and her mother across the city from Marty's apartment. Her husband, Douglas, said that he last saw her on August the 5th. Even though they were separated, Douglas really loved her. Sister Denise Ware, principal of St. Elizabeth's School, said that Mary was really involved in the church. She was one of the most cooperative parents they ever had at school. When there was a problem with the kids, she would be right there. Phyllis Healy, her childhood friend, said that nothing would have caused her to leave her children except the cocaine addiction that she just couldn't control. But I think the most terrifying thing is that Cookie actually predicted her own death. Her father, William Jeter, saw her when she stopped by his house 2 weeks earlier, asking to borrow $3 to get something to eat. That's when she told him, "Don't worry about me, Dad. Worry about the others." William felt that his daughter was telling him to look after her children. He thinks that Cookie sensed her own death. In the following days, the horrific discovery was also closely watched on TV by Louise Baker. Just like William, she also suspected that one of the bodies discovered was that of Cookie. She last saw her daughter Cookie in late July, around 1 week after her 36th birthday. She took her from a homeless shelter. Louise and Cookie's 3 daughters, who I believe were living with Louise, their grandmother, when they last saw Cookie, they shampooed her hair, they tied it into a ponytail, combed out bangs, changed her clothing, and fed her a chopped barbecue sandwich. Cookie then left soon after, and this was around 2 weeks before her body was discovered. Louise and Cookie's daughters, they grew more and more concerned about Cookie. Douglas, Cookie's husband, was at his desk at a drug rehabilitation center 3 days after the bodies were discovered. He was also very worried about Cookie after he heard about the bodies on the news. And when he saw a familiar shirt on the screen, he just jumped. The short sleeve shirt, decorated with a red rose and French writing, was just like the one he had bought Cookie the last time he saw her on August the 5th, days before the bodies were discovered. Douglas couldn't work or eat that day, and after talking with a few of his co-workers, he decided to call the homicide detectives. Now let's go back to the investigation. While the police staff worked really hard to piece the puzzle together, Lillian Graham was receiving the phone call that could provide investigators with a lot of answers. It was Marty, her son. On August 17th, Marty tracked down his mother. He called her hungry and tired. He was wondering if she could meet with him and, just get him something to eat. According to Marty, his mother was able to talk some sense into him, telling him to stop running because whatever happened, they can just work it out. She told him to just come home, they love him, and his whole family loves him. Which again, if I might add, kind of sounds to me like this was set up by the police. I didn't come across this information, but after all of these criminal series that I'm watching on TV, including Criminal Minds, NCIS, Law and Order, it kind of sounds to me like what police would tell loved ones to say to a suspect, to just convince them to go home so that they can be arrested. I don't know, but maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm watching too much of these criminal shows. Anyway, his mother convinced him to surrender, then she called the police. On August 17th, Marty waited at the street corner for the police to pick him up. He was arrested on the same day by Philadelphia police officer Ed Spangler and police officer Larry Brzezinski at a distance of 10 blocks from the apartment. He was taken to the police station where he readily confessed to all of the killings. Among the seized evidence that police took was his Cookie Monster puppet, which he asked to have back. I sleep with that, he said, but the puppet remained in evidence. The police officers, they continued to press Marty until finally he admitted that he played a role in the murders of 7 women. He had tried for hours to convince the police that the bodies had been there when he moved in the complex. But then he admitted to one killing, then finally told the whole truth. With a twist, however, it wasn't him who did it. It may have been his hands, but it wasn't his mind. It was Marty, he explained. He went on to say, quote, "My mama told me to read my Bible, and hell had no place for sin. But he done these things. I love my Bible, and I had no place for these things. He done these things," end of quote. When Marty was little, according to him and also according to the research of investigators, his family life wasn't all that good. For some time, he was placed in foster care when his mother couldn't take care of him. At an early age, he was the lover, if you can call it that, to an employee of a male pimp. With problems at home, he would often spend his time on the streets where for the first time he felt deeply loved. This is what he says, but surely as a boy, the streets are not a loving place. He was introduced to homosexual relationships, prostitution, and drugs. And again, I want to emphasize this because I keep coming across references like these in various cases I cover. Why are these children referred to as lovers of adults or prostitutes selling themselves and stuff like that? They are children, they are not prostitutes. They are forced into sex work, they are not lovers, they are groomed to feel as if they are loved, and it's completely normal to be in these kinds of relationships. So, how about we just stop calling children prostitutes and soliciting or selling themselves? It's just wrong. Don't get me wrong, it does in no way justify their behaviors as adults. However, you can kind of understand why some turn out the way they do as adults, right? I'm not saying that all of the children who are abused, all children who are victims of trafficking will turn out criminals. All I'm saying is that everyone deals differently with trauma and shapes them differently as they grow up. Anyway, going back to Marty. In his early teens, his mother had a spiritual revelation. This was actually forced on him. She would drag him off the streets and start preaching the immoralities of his lifestyle, even though she wasn't really involved in his life for a very long time. There were specific incidents in Marty's childhood and teenage years that were significant in the separating of his person. He was the loving and rehabilitated Christian son, but he was also the opposite, the homosexual addict with a passion for the underbelly of street living. So for him, it was only a matter of time before he split his personality, giving it another name, so that his guilt could be transferred to this other person, allowing the other one to live his life free of the responsibility of his perverse sexual needs and drug habits, and finally his serial crimes. So it's not surprising that among his victims was his ex-girlfriend Robin DeShazer. Marty said in an interview, "I wanted so badly to love her, but I could not stop my need to do the other things. I never liked the sex, and it got so much easier when I didn't have to see her." He felt better having sex with his girlfriend after he strangled her. He also said that she knew about Marty and his desires. "I didn't want her looking at me that way, and I seen God being angry through her eyes." I mean, I think you can kind of tell that he was delusional and really believe that he's not Marty. He's this other person, he's Harrison. It wasn't him killing all of these victims, it was Marty. 30-year-old Robin Lorraine DeShazer was Marty's ex-girlfriend, as I said. She used to live in the apartment with Marty when they were in a relationship. Her mom, Camelia Parker, said that she hadn't seen her daughter for more than 3 years before finding out what happened to her. According to family members, she sadly was also a drug addict, and it seems that Marty had sex with her deceased body, according to what he told one of his other girlfriends who would later testify at trial. Apparently, Marty killed Robin because he was angry that she was seeing other men. Marty's mother told the police that in 1981, after an argument with Marty, she visited his apartment where Robin was living and saw them use drugs together. An acquaintance of Marty also claimed that in 1984 he saw him beat Robin. And unfortunately, I couldn't really find any more information about Robin. This is everything that I found from archived newspaper articles. Marty confessed to the police that with Robin, he was so shaken by what he did and so afraid of what to do next that he just left her body in his apartment, and it was only when he brought a different woman to the apartment that he tried to hide her by hoisting the body on the roof through a bedroom window. The leg and foot bones were found on the roof. The skull and torso were found in the basement of a nearby house. And according to Eugene Willard, the spokesman for the medical examiner's office, the remains were separated after the body decayed considerably, with no evidence that it was mutilated. Marty lured all of his victims, whether he knew them personally or met them on the street, with drugs. Consensual sex would lead to strangulation, which, according to Marty, always shocked him in the morning when he would wake up to find a woman lying next to him dead. In his confession, Marty said that he strangled the 7 women after sharing drugs with them during sex. He committed the first murder at the end of 1986 and killed one of the victims only because she discovered one of the bodies. A forensic exam partially confirmed his testimony, concluding that the 2 recent victims had been strangled 10 days before they were discovered, while the other 5 were dead for 6 to 12 months. The victims were identified as 27-year-old Cynthia Brooks, 25-year-old Valerie Jamieson, 36-year-old Mary Jeter Mattis, 22-year-old Barbara Mahoney, 29-year-old Robin DeShazer, his ex-girlfriend, 33-year-old Sandra Garvin, and 24-year-old Patricia Franklin. One of the unidentified victims was with the forensic sculptor Frank Bender, whose studio was on Philadelphia's South Street. Since 1976, he worked with law enforcement to help with victim identification and the age progression of fugitives. He was asked to assist with the identification of this victim. She was a tall, thin, black woman between 20 and 30 years old with a narrow skull. She was found almost skeletonized under the decomposing corpse of another woman. At the time of her death, she was wearing khaki slacks and two long-sleeved shirts, and the two earrings found next to her were presumed to be hers. Frank started working on this straight away. He defleshed the skull and placed tiny rubber posts on it to guide him in adding around 5 pounds of brown clay for the right tissue depth. The elongated face made this victim more of an individual with a unique appearance, a pointed chin and an asymmetrical nose. Adding a hairstyle that he believed was right for her, Frank had photos taken for the newspapers. Then authorities waited, hoping that someone would recognize her and come forward. An older couple reported that their daughter was missing for 6 months. They knew that she was an acquaintance of Marty's, and the description they gave was a match. The medical examiner's office investigator got the young woman's medical records to compare against the remains. He also showed the family photos of the completed bust, but they weren't sure. However, others who knew the missing woman believed that the sculpture resembled her, and they remembered the earrings that she wore were just like those found next to the body. A past chest x-ray which showed an odd characteristics of one rib finally confirmed it on January 26, 1988. She was 25-year-old Valerie Jamieson, the mother of 2 sons who disappeared in April the year before. Marty said that he didn't know Sandra Garvin, another one of his victims. He picked her up on the street and took her to his apartment, luring her, just like the other victims, with an offer of alcohol and drugs, Ritalin, which is a stimulant, and Talwin, which is a painkiller. He also said that he shared drugs with her before strangling her with his hands during sex. However, police would learn from his neighbors that he actually knew Sandra, and she was a friend of his who went to his apartment a few times. Sandra was last seen around the 10th of May near Marty's home. Her body was identified through medical records and x-rays provided by her family. Leroy Artisan, the father of 33-year-old Sandra, remembered her as a cheerful person, and after Marty's trial ended, Leroy said that it was time to put all of this behind. 24-year-old Patricia Franklin was a young mother of 2, and her family were really hoping that she wouldn't be one of the victims. Ronald, her brother, said that the last time he saw her was in April. When his sister didn't return home, Ronald started looking for her along 19th Street, close to Marty's home, because she frequented the area. She used to take pills, including Ritalin and Talwin. Her brother said that's one of the reasons she went in the area, and it's quite possible she knew Marty. He saw Marty before sitting in front of his house. Ronald said that he posted homemade signs looking for more information about Patricia at stores and at laundromats, including in the area of 19th Street. The family also took out a newspaper ad in early May. They were really worried about her, but they never heard anything. Patricia was lured to Marty's apartment the same way that Sandra was, and not far from Ronald's home, neighbors got worried about 22-year-old Barbara Mahoney, who lived in a 3-story house on Bolton Street. Mark Slocum said that Barbara would also often spend time on 19th Street, 5 blocks away from Martin's house. Barbara was one of Marty's other victims. During interrogation, Marty wrote a 10-page confession. However, during his arraignment, the question of mental illness was raised. Joel S. Moldovsky was appointed as his public defender, and immediately Whether Marty was capable of signing his own confession was argued. While detectives claimed that the confession was procedurally sound, with the suspect's mother present, Moldovsky was able to successfully point to due process conflict. He claimed that Marty was never told he had the right to have an attorney present. On August 27, 1986, a detective read through the gruesome account of findings during a 6-hour hearing. Marty was agitated, rocking back and forth as the detective read what the defendant described maggots in his apartment as fur ball bugs to a visitor. He had to stay high all the time to ignore the birds eating a body outside his window. Drugged and in a paranoid state to begin with, Marty was panicked when police arrived, throwing the bodies into the back bedroom. Until that point, he staged the bodies of his most recent murders in the front room. He then quickly boarded up the door and ran. Dr. Robert Stanton, a psychiatrist, evaluated Marty, giving him an IQ of 63, which is considered to be less than mentally competent. This, with his substance abuse and addictions, resulted in a man who, according to the laws of state of Philadelphia, was incapable. Marty was suffering from chemical-induced auditory hallucinations, psychosis, blackouts, and chronic paranoia. A psychologist by the name of Albert Levitt testified that aside from Marty's chemical and psychological issues, he was incompetent in fundamental academic skills: reading, writing, math, and telling time. However, Judge Edward Meckel still declared Marty competent to stand trial. He based his opinion partly on the DA's counselor Robert Sardoff, who told reporters that he felt Marty was able during the initial confession. Moldovsky, Marty's lawyer, was arguing insanity, specifically a multiple personality disorder. During an interview with Philadelphia's Daily News, the attorney said that Harrison often spoke in a second and third personality. Marty was an easygoing handyman. He liked his mother, he was heterosexual, and a religious zealot. At times, Junior would show himself. This personality was most familiar as the childlike male whose neighbors remembered hanging onto his Cookie Monster stuffed animal. It was Frank who was responsible for the heinous crimes of both murder and necrophilia. It was Frank who couldn't stand to be with a woman, in contrast with Marty, who hated the sinful nature of homosexuality, who felt it was a condemnation to eternal death. Frank, however, was streetwise, with a desire for drugs and harder core homosexual relations, including his own prostitution. Again, something he was introduced to in his own teenage years. Harrison was involved in a fight in prison, and he actually blamed his part on Frank. A psychologist, Dr. Gerald Cook, gave a statement that Marty had organic brain damage, even though he was not an expert on the subject, and this had already been dismissed by a neurologist. The psychologist also said that Marty suffered from sexual sadism, which is not a mental illness that makes a person insane or absolves him of guilt. A psychiatrist for the defense said that since Marty said he couldn't remember the first 5 murders, it was not possible to judge his mental state at the time of those crimes. However, during the last 2 incidents, he had hallucinated the voices of both God and the devil. Thus, he had been psychotic. Lillian, Marty's mom, didn't believe that he would be capable of such things. She said that he was too simple and too non-violent. Even if he had gone off because of the alcohol or drugs he was accused of abusing, he couldn't plan such crimes or hide bodies. As adamant as she was, she guided her son away from a jury trial, explaining to him that while he was innocent, she knew that the jury would be prejudiced once the prosecutors revealed their crimes in photos. At Marty's murder trial, 2 of his former girlfriends and his foster mother all provided details about his development, character, and MO. Then, just before the judge ruled, the prosecution entered the surprise witness. A woman named Paula lived with Marty for 3 years, and she said that during sex, he would place his hands around her throat and squeeze. On several occasions, she thought that he was killing her. He told her that he'd killed one of his former girlfriends, Robin, and he'd threatened Paula with the same treatment, sometimes barricading her into the apartment, waving a machete at her, or raping her when she was in a daze from drugs. Paula also visited Marty after she moved out and smelled a foul stench coming from the room they had used as a bedroom. Allegedly, Marty told her at the time that the smell was coming from a urine bucket and warned her never to look into that room. Paula was frightened that he would do the same thing to her that he did to Robin if she broke off their relationship. His excuse for strangling the woman to death was simply that she tried to leave him. But Paula didn't dare. According to her testimony, the woman endured rape, beatings, and torture at the hands of Marty. But what was supposed to be a win for the state turned out to be an accomplishment for the defense. First of all, Robin was beaten, she wasn't strangled, leading to the conclusion that the witness lied about her former boyfriend's testimony. Further, Marty had no history of long-term relationships. He killed his only so-called girlfriend. It didn't fit the pattern of his murders or personality to have maintained a 3-year relationship with any woman, much less one that would leave. Paula's statements that Marty kept her in drug-induced stages and was often using himself only added to the defense's claims that Marty was not in control of his actions. Mary Hogan also testified. She also lived with Marty and she said they would have sex 4 or 5 times a day. He tried to strangle her as well, and she saw Robin's decomposing remains on the roof outside the apartment. In order to get out with her belongings, she had to ask help from the police because Marty threatened to kill her with a machete and he had shot her inside the apartment. The police apparently didn't see the body on the roof at that time. First witness on Marty's behalf during his trial was his former foster mother, Wilhelmina Williams, who took him into her home from the ages of 2 through 7 years old when his mother was unable to care for her children. Wilhelmina said that Marty was a slow learner and he was essentially incapable of taking care of himself. She's never seen him learn to read or write. Marty's mother supported this when she said that her son seemed unable to learn anything. Unlike her other children, he failed to grasp the difference between right and wrong. He was also a head beater and a troublemaker in school and suffered from recurring nightmares. On March the 8th, Marty told the judge that he was not responsible for the murders and that someone else had done it. He put his faith in Judge Latron's hands, waiving his right to a jury. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse on all counts. His attorney told reporters that he doubted Marty knew that he was found guilty or what the ramifications of that would mean. Marty told reporters that everything would work out just fine. He requested his Cookie Monster to be given back to him now that it was no longer needed as evidence after it was held for the trial. Moldovsky, his lawyer, was never required to fight for Marty because in May, Judge Latron ruled that while he would sentence Marty to 6 death sentences, he would first be remanded to prison to serve out a life term. The single life sentence was for Robin's murder. She was the first, so there were no other murders to add aggravating factors. He was additionally sentenced by Judge Latron to serve 6 consecutive sentences of 7 to 14 years each. Marty's mother was not able to make herself present for the ruling. However, his attorney was relieved, defining the judge's motion as Solomonic. By allowing Martin to serve his convictions of death prior to his life sentencing, he had achieved a life sentence without possibility of parole. Judge Latron took into account the mitigating factors of Marty's abusive, neglectful childhood. Marty had learned to adapt to unthinkable circumstances and as a boy, and to survive, it was acceptable to believe that he developed altered personalities not uncommon for broken adults, which stems from tragic early childhood conditions. Camelia DeShazer, the mother of victim Robin DeShazer, cried outside the courtroom after the verdict. She said, quote, "I guess justice was done. I still hate him." End of quote. When asked if Marty should get the death penalty, she said that he deserves anything he gets. Leroy Artisan, the father of Sandra Garvin, said, "I wouldn't say she's resting easy, but I would hope. This has been one of the most excruciating phases of my life, just having to go there and sitting through it. I guess time heals all things." End of quote. Until 1994, Harrison Graham was a prisoner at Harrisburg Penitentiary in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But then the Supreme Court, after a routine review, deemed his sentence unethical and illegal. The court ruled that Marty's life sentence be overturned and that the death sentence be implemented. He was then scheduled to die on December the 7th, 1998. Judge Latron was again in the position of making a decision to let him live or die. He stayed the execution. The case spent much of its time in appeals in and out of higher courts until 2002, when the US Supreme Court banned the executions of all mentally retarded criminals. But Marty didn't meet the initial requirements of the ban. As stated by a psychiatrist involved in his case, he tested lower than he functioned, so even if his IQ was below 70, he was not mentally retarded. But because according to the criteria established by the American Psychiatric Association, that an onset of mental illness occurring before the age of 18 years mandated the same relief from execution, so Harrison Graham was permanently off of death row. Today, Harrison is in a medium security facility in Pennsylvania. His case manager described him as mild and non-violent. He received a minister's certificate and continues to practice his faith religiously. So we are almost towards the end of the video, and before I give you my opinion on this case, let me just go back to the word in Romanian which I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So the word in Romanian, like I said, is Moș Nicolae. Moș Nicolae, which in English means Saint Nicholas. I'm sure that there are religions who are celebrating this as a saint name. So in Romania, Saint Nicholas is celebrated on the night of 5th of December, going towards the 6th of December. And he is the man who is bringing children gifts through the night from the 5th to the 6th of December. So the way it works is that children, they need to clean up their boots. They need their boots, their shoes. On the 5th, in the evening, they need to leave them out by the door, or, in front of the door or outside if they have a garden or so on and so forth. And if they have been good throughout the years, in the morning when they wake up and they go and check their boots, they have gifts in the boots given by Saint Nicholas. However, if they've been naughty and they've done, bad things throughout the years, they only receive a twig as a sign that they've been naughty. So this is basically a tradition. I mean, it used to be different many, many years ago, where there would have been a different kind of tradition around the shoes or the boots worn or whatever. But now, going into modern times, you can kind of use any kind of shoes you want. And now going to the opinions, to my opinions on this case. Now, I do have the feeling that if Marty wouldn't have waived his right to a jury trial, maybe he would have been found incompetent and he wouldn't receive the same sentencing. I mean, I don't know. What do you guys think? Yes, I agree, it was horrendous what he did and he obviously has to pay for it. However, the question is he really mentally fit, mentally stable? On the one hand, I keep saying that yes, he is, but then I keep changing my mind and, I keep on kind of going around in circles. Does he deserve to spend his life in prison, or he should spend his life in a mental hospital instead and receive the proper treatment? Because if indeed he has borderline personality disorder, he needs treatment, and I'm sure that prison is not going to help him achieve that. So yeah, anyway guys, please do let me know in the comments below what do you think about today's case. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.